It was another game night at our house, and I was setting up snacks on the table when he walked in, right on time, carrying a bottle of wine and that new board game he had mentioned last week. "Hope I'm not too late for game night," he called out as he entered. "You're just in time," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and excitement. We hugged briefly, a comfortable, familiar gesture, and he set his things down on the table. "I brought the new game I mentioned. Ready to see who's the best?" he asked with a grin. "Let's find out," I said, trying to sound more playful than nervous. As we settled down to play, the room filled with the familiar sounds of laughter and cards shuffling. I couldn't help but watch him as he concentrated on the game, his smile more captivating than I remembered. When our eyes met, something felt different this time, like a spark or a silent acknowledgement of something more between us. "Your move. No pressure," I teased, trying to keep the mood light despite the growing tension I felt. "Right. Just strategizing. It's all in the tactics," he replied, not breaking eye contact. As the game went on, I laughed and chatted with the others, but my thoughts kept drifting to him and that look we shared. It was just a simple game night, wasn't it? But why did it feel like there was more hanging in the air tonight? As everyone continued to play, I found myself wondering about the implications of this new, subtle shift between us. What was happening? Was this the start of something neither of us could have predicted? Ever since he first started coming around, it was clear we had a few common interests, things I could talk about freely that didn't quite click with anyone else, not even my husband. It started with small talk, him asking questions about a novel I was reading one evening when he dropped by. I remember the book lay on the coffee table, its cover catching his eye immediately. "Is that the new one by Elif Shafak?" he asked, surprising me a bit since it wasn't exactly mainstream. "Yes, actually, have you read it?" I replied, and that kicked off our first real conversation. We spent the whole evening discussing our favorite authors and books, and I felt a connection that was both exciting and deeply comforting. From then on, he would ask about my recommendations whenever he had the chance, and I would share whatever was on my reading list. Our talks soon expanded beyond books. We found out we both loved the same type of music, and sometimes he'd send me a link to a track he thought I'd like. "Thought of you when I heard this," his messages would say, and every time my phone pinged with a message from him, I couldn't help but smile. These exchanges became the highlights of my week. It was all very innocent at first. We were just two people who enjoyed each other's company, finding solace in shared interests that seemed to create a little world of our own. My husband noticed how animated I became when discussing books or music, and he was happy I had someone to share that with, since he couldn't always relate. But as the weeks turned into months, our friendship deepened. We started sharing more personal stories and experiences. I found myself waiting eagerly for his visits, anticipating our conversations. It felt like we understood each other on a level that was rare and precious. He became someone I could confide in, someone who not only shared my interests, but also seemed to understand my thoughts and feelings without judgment. We'd sit for hours talking, sometimes over coffee on a lazy Saturday afternoon when my husband was out. He'd listen intently as I explained why a particular piece of music moved me, or why a book made me cry, and he'd share his own experiences in return. Our connection felt profound, rooted in a genuine understanding of each other's inner worlds. It was during one of these conversations, on a cool evening with only the soft hum of the living room lamp for company, that I realized how much I had come to value his presence in my life. We were discussing a film we had both seen recently, delving into its themes and characters when he said, "I really get why you liked this. It's like it speaks directly to you." His words, simple yet insightful, made me pause. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the kindness and warmth in his eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I felt a surge of affection, more intense than the simple fondness I had felt before. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the quiet house, thinking about our friendship. It had started so innocently, just two people sharing interests. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was evolving into something more, something I hadn't anticipated. I wondered where this path would lead us, aware that the simplicity of our initial connection was perhaps growing into a complexity I hadn't intended. Yet, there was also a part of me that was curious, maybe even a little excited, to see where this newfound closeness would take us. It started as nothing more than shared laughter over cups of coffee and discussions about books and movies that we both loved. However, as the days turned into weeks, I found myself eagerly anticipating his visits, not just for the companionship, but for the deeper conversations that had begun to weave their way between us. Our talks started drifting from casual chats about favorite authors to more personal territories, like our aspirations and the quiet fears we hardly voiced to others. He had a way of listening that made me feel heard and understood, a rarity that I cherished more than I initially realized. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to blanket the yard, he shared a story about his childhood, a bittersweet memory that seemed to hang between us, tender and raw. It struck a chord in me, prompting me to reveal my own similar experiences, things I'd never shared with anyone else, not even my husband. There was comfort in sharing these pieces of ourselves, a trust that built quietly but steadily. As these heart-to-hearts became more frequent, I noticed a subtle shift in my feelings. What had been a simple friendship was slowly morphing into something deeper. The realization came one night when he called me because he was feeling down. Hearing the distress in his voice pulled at something in me, a desire to be there for him in any way I could. It was late, but I didn't think twice about answering his call, trying to offer comfort. After the call, I lay awake, my husband sleeping peacefully beside me, and I couldn't shake off a swirling mix of emotions: guilt for my growing feelings, fear of where it all might lead, and a surprising thrill at being someone's confidant and comforter. These emotions confused me. I was married, happily I had thought, and here I was, feeling something for another man, something I couldn't quite label but couldn't ignore either. Each time he visited after that, I found myself dressing a bit more carefully, or trying a new recipe that I hoped would impress him. It was as if I was back in the early days of dating, feeling a rush of nerves and excitement at the prospect of seeing him. The guilt was the hardest part. It weighed on me, a constant reminder that my feelings were wandering into dangerous territory. But alongside the guilt was a thrill, an excitement that I hadn't felt in years, which only added to my confusion. I didn't want to betray my husband, but I also couldn't deny the emotional connection that was clearly forming between me and his friend. One day, it all came to a head. We were sitting in my living room, a familiar setting that had witnessed many of our deepest conversations. The house was quiet, too quiet, and there was a palpable tension in the air. He was talking about his plans for the future, and I found myself imagining what it would be like to be a part of those plans. It scared me, how much I wanted that. As he spoke, I caught myself staring, really staring at him, seeing him not just as a friend, but as something more. The moment stretched, loaded with unspoken questions and realizations. That was the turning point. I knew then that I had to make a choice. I could no longer pretend that what I felt was just friendship. The emotional connection was undeniable, deep and potentially life-altering. I needed to confront these feelings, understand them, and decide what they meant for my marriage and my future. It was a crossroads moment, and whatever path I chose, I knew things would never be the same again. It was during one of our usual gatherings at home, a casual evening where everyone was spread out in different parts of the house, engaged in various discussions or games. The house buzzed with the kind of warm energy that only a good gathering of friends can create. He was there, as usual, the friend who had gradually become much more in my mind than just a casual acquaintance. As the night wore on, the crowd thinned, and people started heading home. He stayed back to help clean up, a gesture that was not unusual, but felt different that night because of everything that had been building up between us. We found ourselves alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the clutter of a night well spent. I was rinsing some dishes at the sink, and he was wiping down the counters. Our movements around the kitchen were coordinated, a dance we had gotten used to over the months of his frequent visits. There was a moment when I dropped a fork, and as we both reached to pick it up, our hands touched. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. We both paused, our hands still close to each other on the floor, and as I looked up, our eyes met. There was a silent acknowledgement of something more, something neither of us could deny anymore. The air around us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. I stood up slowly, aware of his gaze still on me. The usual background noise of laughter and chatter was absent, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. It was as if the entire world had narrowed down to the small space between us. "I should finish up here," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and for a second I thought he would just leave, but instead he moved closer. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice low, almost afraid of breaking the spell between us. I couldn't deny it. Denying it would mean lying to myself. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of that simple admission. We stood there, caught in a moment of truth, aware that crossing that line could mean consequences that neither of us might be ready to face. It was a critical moment, a turning point that I knew would define the path of our relationship and potentially the future of my marriage. He looked at me, really looked at me, with a depth I hadn't seen before. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice reflecting the turmoil that I felt. I took a deep breath, my mind racing with thoughts of my husband, our life together, and the possible fallout of this moment. "We can't," I finally said, the words feeling like a lifeline to the life I was supposed to lead. "We just can't." He nodded slowly, the understanding between us clear. There was disappointment in his eyes, but also a respect for the boundaries I was trying to maintain. He helped me finish cleaning up in silence, the air between us now filled with a bittersweet understanding. When he left that night, the goodbye was different, heavier. That moment in the kitchen lingered in my mind long after he was gone, a reminder of what could have been and what had to be. It was the moment I chose my marriage, my commitment, despite the undeniable connection I felt with him. It was a choice that didn't come easy, but it was the right one. For me, for my husband, and for the respect of the life we had built together. It was late in the evening, the remnants of laughter still echoing softly through the walls as the last of our guests trickled out. I was left standing amidst the clutter of a night that had started with joy and ended in a revelation that shook me to my core. He and I had found ourselves alone momentarily, an innocent enough situation, yet charged with an undercurrent of something that had been simmering just beneath the surface for weeks. As I busied myself cleaning up, trying to focus on the clink of glasses and the swish of water, he stayed to help. The normalcy of our actions belied the tension between us. It was during these quiet moments under the guise of casual conversation that a line was crossed. A touch lingered longer than necessary. A look held too much meaning, and before I knew it, we had shared a kiss. It was brief, a moment of weakness that neither of us had planned nor resisted in that instant. The weight of what had happened hit me immediately after. Regret washed over me like the cold water running from the tap. My heart raced with fear, not just of the potential consequences if my husband were to find out, but also of my own feelings, which had clearly begun to stray. How had I allowed this to happen? He was my husband's friend, a frequent visitor to our home, now marked by this moment of indiscretion. He and I quickly agreed to keep this a secret. It was a mutual decision, spoken in hushed tones with a seriousness that reflected our understanding of the gravity of the situation. "This changes nothing," he had said, his voice firm yet regretful. "It can't happen again." I nodded, feeling the sting of tears behind my eyes, not out of love or longing for what had occurred, but out of remorse for the betrayal of the man I truly loved, my husband. The following days were a blur of internal turmoil. I moved through my routines mechanically, each task tinged with the guilt of that moment. The secret was a heavy shadow trailing me, darkening moments that should have been happy. My husband's smile, once a source of comfort, now felt like an accusation. Every kind word from him was a reminder of what I had jeopardized. Keeping the secret proved to be a torment all its own. It gnawed at me, an ever-present ache in the pit of my stomach. I would lie awake at night, replaying that brief, ill-considered kiss, each time punishing myself anew for the lapse in judgment. Yet I held on to the secret, fearful that revealing it would destroy my marriage, shatter the trust we had built over years, and ruin the friendship among us three. I tried to convince myself that by burying this mistake, I was protecting everyone involved from unnecessary pain. But as days turned into weeks, I realized that the heaviest burden was not just keeping the secret, but living with the knowledge that I had allowed a momentary lapse to challenge the integrity of our marriage. This realization led to a deeper reflection on my values and commitments. I needed to find a way back to the life I cherished before this transgression, even if the path was fraught with challenges of its own. After the incident, everything felt different. My routine remained the same on the surface. I would wake up, make coffee, go to work, come home. But internally, I was in turmoil. My guilt was like a silent shadow that accompanied me everywhere, tainting every interaction with my husband. He noticed the change, of course. How could he not? The man who had known me so deeply now saw a stranger before him. I began to pull away instinctively. It was the small things at first. I stopped reaching for his hand during our evening walks. My laughter at his jokes became less frequent. My responses during conversations grew shorter, and my mind seemed perpetually distracted. I was there, but not quite there. He felt it. I could see the confusion and concern in his eyes. One evening, he asked me outright if something was wrong. "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay at work?" he inquired, his voice laced with worry. I nodded, muttering something about stress and deadlines, knowing how inadequate my excuses sounded. The truth was too heavy to share, too damaging. I feared the wreckage it would bring. Each day, the weight of what I had done grew heavier, pressing down on me until I felt I couldn't breathe. I was living a double life, the loving wife in his presence, and the guilt-ridden betrayer in his absence. The emotional distance between us grew, forming a chasm filled with unsaid words and unshed tears. The guilt was a relentless companion. It gnawed at me during quiet moments, consumed my thoughts when I should have been focusing on other things. It manifested physically, too. I began to lose sleep, my appetite waned, and I found myself staring into space, lost in a sea of regret. The vibrant person I once was started to fade away, replaced by a shell of my former self. It wasn't just the act itself that haunted me. It was the betrayal of the trust we had built over years of marriage. My husband had always been there for me, through every high and low, and here I was, harboring a secret that could dismantle everything we cherished. The fear of losing him, of destroying the life we had created together, was paralyzing. I realized then that I couldn't carry this burden alone. The secret was poisoning me, our relationship and the very fabric of our life together. I needed to find the courage to face the consequences of my actions, to confess and hopefully find forgiveness. The thought of revealing the truth terrified me, but the burden of my guilt was becoming unbearable. I knew that honesty was the only path forward, regardless of the outcome. It was time to come clean, to try to heal the wounds I had inflicted, and to start rebuilding the trust I had shattered. The road to redemption was going to be long and uncertain, but necessary if I ever hoped to find peace and restore the love we once shared so fully. The day I decided to confess everything to my husband is still vivid in my memory. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world outside seems to echo the turmoil inside. I sat in our living room, the rain tapping gently against the windows, forming a melancholic symphony that mirrored the dread pooling in my stomach. He came home earlier than usual, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, each one amplifying my anxiety. As he entered the room, his face lit up with a tired smile, the kind he gives after a long day, expecting the comfort of a quiet evening at home. But as he looked at me, sitting rigidly on the sofa, his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked as he sat down beside me. I could hear the worry in his voice, see it etched across his features. The room felt oppressively silent, the kind of silence that weighs on you, thick and heavy. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I reached for his. The touch of his skin was both familiar and comforting, yet it felt like the last thread of normalcy before everything changed. "There's something I need to tell you," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Something happened." The words tumbled out then, halting and hesitant at first, then all at once as if a dam had broken within me. I told him about the kiss, about how it happened, how much I regretted it, and how it was eating me alive. I watched his face as the truth sank in, watched as the range of emotions played across his features: shock, hurt, disbelief. He pulled his hand away slowly, and it felt like he was taking parts of me with him. "Why?" was all he could muster, a simple question loaded with confusion and pain. The conversation that followed was one of the hardest I've ever had. I explained everything, not just the act itself, but the emotions that led up to it, my feelings of confusion and isolation, my failure to guard the boundaries of our relationship. I didn't make excuses because there were none that could justify the breach of trust I had committed. After I finished, there was a long silence, one that stretched out between us like a chasm. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but cold. "I need some time to think about this," he said, standing up. "I don't know if I can get past this, if we can get past this." He left the room then, and the sound of the door closing behind him felt final, like the closing of a book. The next few days were a blur of silence and avoidance. We moved around each other like strangers, polite but distant. It was clear that the revelation had altered everything. The decision to try and mend our relationship came slowly. It started with small gestures, a conversation here, a shared meal there. We began seeing a counselor, unraveling the threads of our marriage, examining each one for signs of wear and tear, and slowly, painstakingly, trying to weave them back together. It wasn't easy. The trust that had been broken couldn't be magically repaired, and some days it felt like we were holding on to mere threads. But we both knew that what we had was worth fighting for. We had built a life together, shared dreams and challenges, laughter and tears. We were more than just one moment of weakness, more than just one mistake. And so we chose each day to try, to forgive a little more, to understand a little better. The road to healing was long and fraught with setbacks, but it was our road, and we were committed to walking it together, however winding it might be.